Hi everyone, and welcome to a new year on Patreon. So hopefully by now you've seen that our new theme is announced, and it is called Society of Charm. And the way I see it, this year is all about a return to the roots of charm patterns. So I want this year to be all about vintage glamour. And I thought, what better place to start than with a beautiful 40s style dress. So this design is called the Society Dress, and I was really inspired by 40s silhouettes. I wanted to design a dress pattern that could just as easily be a casual swing dress for daytime wear as it could be the most glamorous gown made in velvet that you would wear to the meeting of a secret society, for instance. And one thing I really love about this design is that it's so comfortable. I designed it to be made in a knit fabric with 50 to 70% stretch. So it really has that secret pajamas kind of feel. Definitely feels more like wearing loungewear than wearing a fancy dress. And another thing I love about it is that this style, I believe, looks great on everybody. So the dress has gathers at the yoke, under the bust, a fitted midriff with a sort of pointed look to it. And then it has a skirt that's an A-line silhouette, which is so 40s. Now let's talk a little bit about all the options you have in this pattern, because you know, we're charm patterns, we love to give you options. You have two sleeves. You can see the one I'm wearing right now. This is a short sleeve with gathers, and then it has a little box pleat on the side to give it a very tulipy 40s shape. There's also a very dramatic bishop sleeve, so it's long with a lot of gathers on the bottom, and then a fitted cuff. You have the option of the cowl hood, which I just love so much. It's a self-lined hood that gets inserted into this yoke seam, and then it just hangs free in the back, and it drapes down the back, and it creates this beautiful cowl, so you can wear it just as easily down as you can up on your head, very mysteriously. And then you have two skirt options as well. You have your short skirt, which is a simple A-line skirt, but really fits so beautifully. And then if you want to do the full-length gown, we have the full-length skirt, which is so special because we added godets to it. So it has godets inserted into slashes on the front skirt and the back, and then into the side seams. So it has a total of 6 godets around the skirt, which is, if you don't know what a godet is, it's a triangular piece of fabric that gets inserted to create a really gorgeous shape. It reminds me of 30s and 40s gowns. So very beautiful, very dramatic. This could be dressed up in so many ways for so many different occasions. And today I'm going to show you how to sew two different versions of this dress. I'm going to show you the one I think of as more casual, the one I'm wearing now, which is short sleeves and the short skirt. And then I'm also going to show you some of the skills for how to sew the more dramatic elements like the hood, the long bishop sleeve, and the skirt with the godets. But just remember that all of these elements are interchangeable. So one of the styles I love is like the short dress, but with the bishop sleeve, or you could do a short dress with the hood inserted. There are lots of different options, okay? So just remember, you can mix and match as you like. All right, so let's get started talking about the pattern pieces and then fabric and supplies. Okay, so as always, we are going to look at the pattern pieces together before we start sewing. I have minimized these down so that we can look at them all on this tabletop together. Now, just to warn you, because there are a lot of pattern pieces in this design, I've broken them up into two separate groupings, okay, and two possible variations of ways you could make this dress. Of course, there are many mix and match options, but for the purposes of this little chapter, we're going to be talking about it first as a short knee-length swing dress with the short sleeve, like the one I'm wearing right now. And then secondly, we'll be talking about the long gown version with the godets, the bishop sleeve, and the hood. Okay, but just know that you can mix and match those elements as you want, but just for the purposes of demonstration, I'm going to be looking at them in two separate groupings. Okay, so first for the short knee-length dress with the short sleeve. For both of the dresses I just mentioned, you are going to have the same bodice pieces. You have your bodice front with its V-neck and under bust gathering here. So that's what those circles are right there. You also have gathering at the shoulder. And then let's look at the bodice back, which is cut on the fold. And then I know it looks like it has a really deep back neckline, but what's actually happening here is that we have a cut on yoke on the back bodice. So it wraps around to the front and the seam is forward here, right? So it really showcases those gathers rather than having a traditional shoulder seam on the top of your shoulder here. Okay, so where you see that notch about right here, that's where the shoulder seam would usually be. We have added that cut on yoke to extend the shoulder around to the front. Okay, and then you have your circles to match the hood and your gathering there. And then your midriff pieces, you have your midriff front, which is cut on the fold, and you can see it comes up into this nice pointed shape at center front. Circles to match your gathering. And then on the back, you're also going to cut this on the fold. And again, circles to match your gathering. Now, all of these you would cut in your fabric, except for the midriff front, which you would cut in your fabric and power mesh. If you want a little stability there, a little extra structure, we love to use power mesh in our designs because it gives you just a little bit of extra stability and structure in a knit. Okay, so that is your bodice front pieces and back. And then you have your facings as well. So your front facing here for the front bodice, and then your back facing. So both of these will be cut in fabric and a lightweight interfacing. Now your A-line skirt pieces, pretty self-explanatory. They're both cut on the fold because there are no closures in this dress, no zipper, no buttons or anything. Has to be pulled on over the head. These are both cut on the fold. So we've got the center front fold here and then the center back here. And these are your side seams. And then finally for this variation, you have your short sleeve. This sleeve is so 40s. You can see it has a bit of it's like a short sleeve with a more dramatic shape to it. So it has a very rounded high cap here. And that is for the gathers on the sleeve. And then we've also included a box pleat right here to give you kind of that tulip shape that you see on 40s style sleeves. So that's what those lines are for on the bottom of the sleeve. And that is it for your short swing dress version. Okay, so the next group of pattern pieces we're going to be talking about is for the long gown version with the hood and the bishop sleeve. So all the more dramatic pieces in this grouping. Now, as I mentioned, you have the same bodice pieces for both. So you can see I have my bodice front, bodice back, midriff front, midriff back, front facing, back facing, okay? And then these other pieces are what you would add on for this variation. Let's look at the hood first. This hood is kind of unusual, and I designed it by looking at 40s gowns with hoods and seeing how they were attached. And I noticed that they weren't sewn into the neckline in the traditional way we think of a hood being sewn in. They're more like a cowl drape, and they would often just attach at the shoulders and then hang loose at the back neckline and down the back. So I really wanted to recreate that little historical detail, and that's what we have here. This is essentially a cowl shape that gets inserted into that front yoke seam. Okay, so this little curved seam down here, you can see it has matching circles for the bodice front for the yoke, where they match up right here after the front is gathered. And you're going to cut 4 of this hood cowl, and you're going to sew them together at this outer curved seam, and then they line each other, so it's self-lined. These edges get finished, and then just the short ends get inserted into that yoke seam right here. So then it drapes down the back really beautifully. So it looks, I love this hood because it looks as great off, just draped down like it's just a cowl for the dress, as it does if you kind of, do the mysterious pull it up over your 40s style hairdo. Okay, so that is the hood. Next, let's talk about the sleeve. You know I love a statement sleeve, so we've seen this shape before. It's essentially a bishop sleeve. So you can see it has a more traditional shape at the cap with no gathering. And then at the bottom, it's flared with a curve and 2 gathering circles. So you would be gathering the lower edge, the wrist of the sleeve. Now, the cuff, I know, looks a little bit strange. It is a very slim cuff, and we've never done something like this before. I'm really excited about it. So what happens is it gets folded up this way and then into a ring to form that nice slim cuff that's like 4 inches tall. And then the bishop sleeve kind of drapes over it. It looks really beautiful. Okay, so that is your cuff and your sleeve. And then let's talk about the skirt. Now, we went through a lot of debating about this skirt, trying to figure out how we were going to get it to look really, really beautiful and have that beautiful 40s shape, while also getting it to fit onto traditional 45 to 60 inch wide fabric, because the longer a skirt gets, the more wide it gets at the bottom, right? If it's flared at all. So we found that if we just extended it out from the side seam, it got so wide at the hem that we couldn't fit it on something like a 60 inch stretch velvet without having to piece it. So in came the solution of having a godet, which is a very 30s, 40s detail where you create these slimmer triangular shaped pieces, and the godet gets inserted in between the side seams here. All right, so it's sort of like a pieced detail. But to also make this super dramatic, as you know we like to do here at Charm, we wanted to add some godets in the front and back as well. So we have a slash line here at the front and at the back. And what we're going to do is insert these godets into the front of the skirt and into the back, so that you have 6 godets all the way around the skirt, and it creates this really beautiful vintage look. Okay, so that is your long skirt with godets. And like I said, the great thing about it is that you can, because we have pieced it into narrower pieces, you can fit this onto fabric that's 45 to 60 inches wide, and including fabric like velvet with a nap where you can't turn the pieces around without having it look really noticeable and wrong, right? So that is your gown pieces. As I mentioned, you can switch up any of these elements. It's mix and match like always. You could put the hood on the short gown. You could put the short sleeve on the long gown. There are so many options here, so just play around with it. But those are the 2 variations I wanted to call out today in this chapter. So next, let's talk about fabric and supplies. Okay, so let's get into talking about fabric and supplies for this dress. Now, this is a knit dress design, and here are some of the fabrics that we used in the samples, as well as a few others that we would recommend. You are looking for light to medium weight knits with 50 to 70% stretch in the widthwise direction, so selvage to selvedge. Now, here are a few of the fabrics that we used. Stretch velvet works great for this dress. You're looking for something, again, with stretch in the widthwise direction and then little to no stretch in the lengthwise. It can have a little bit, but you don't want really like a 4-way stretch. Okay, so stretch velvet works great. Remember that it's going to have a nap, so you're only going to be able to cut the pieces in one direction. You can't flip them around, so you might need a little more fabric for stretch velvet. This leopard here is a velour, which just has a sort of shorter nap, but it's very similar to velvet. We brought out the lurex, again, one of our favorite fabrics here in the studio. So lurex is a jersey with this beautiful tinselly surface. And it is great for this dress, has just the right amount of stretch, and it drapes so beautifully. One that we haven't used yet, but I would potentially recommend, is a matte jersey. It's such a 40s fabric to me. It has that really beautiful drape to it. A lot of it is made in rayon, which is, again, such a 40s fabric. So look for a matte jersey. It comes in such beautiful colors. And then I also wanted to mention Liverpool knit, which I had never sewn with before, but I had this rose print in my stash for a few years and I love it so much. Liverpool knit has this sort of bumpy texture to it, which really gives it the look of like a 40s rayon crepe to me. So it looks very period appropriate as well, while being a stretch jersey with just the right amount of drape, stretch, and the right hand to it for this dress. So those are a few options for the kind of thing you would be looking for. Now for your sort of utility fabrics, we do recommend putting a layer of power mesh in just the midriff front. This is optional, you don't necessarily need it, but it does give you a little bit of structure and stability to that midriff front. So we like to use a heavier, stiffer power mesh, and we will give you the link to this in the instructions, but that would be just for the midriff front, like I said. And then you're going to need some fusible interfacing as well. So that's for your facings. For this dress, I would look for knit interfacing, like a lightweight knit. My personal favorite for jerseys is tricot, a lightweight tricot. You could also get away with using a weft interfacing since it has a nice drape to it. Okay, so those are your utility fabrics. And then you have your poly all-purpose thread here. And you're going to want to look for a stretch or jersey needle, a ballpoint type needle, so that you don't get skipped stitches when you stitch your stretch fabric. Okay, and if you need a refresher on sewing with knits or knit percentages, really recommend that you look back to the fit clinic I did on how stretch percentage affects the fit of a garment and gives you a lot of info onto stretch percentage, stretch content, and why you want to be looking for the right stretch percentage in the fabric that's called out in the design. All right, so those are your fabric and supplies. And next we're going to move on to sewing. Okay, so we're ready to start sewing. So you're going to grab your two bodice fronts, and you are going to be looking for, there's a notch and then a circle right next to the notch. We're going to put these two pieces right sides together and pin them along the center front seam. And we're going to start stitching exactly on that circle and stitch to the bottom of the piece. Okay, I'm going to be stitching with a narrow zigzag using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm starting right on that circle mark. I'm going to start stitching and then back stitch, and then finish stitching this seam using that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and with this center front seam, you'll want to press it open. So depending on your fabric, you may just want to finger press it if your fabric is very susceptible to heat, or you could use a low heat on your iron. And now we're going to talk about the gathers. So you can see I've already done my gathering stitches. There's some on the shoulders between the circle marks, and then 2 lines of gathering stitches on the bust line between the circle marks as well. So on each side. I'm going to go ahead and start pulling up my bobbin threads to start creating these gathers. And keep in mind that you won't really know how many gathers you're going to need or how densely gathered it's going to need to be until you start to pin it to the piece that you're going to sew it to. So for now, just kind of roughly get those gathers in there, pulling up those bobbin threads and creating those gathers. So I'm going to keep going with this, and then we'll come back and talk about the next step. Now we're ready to focus on the bodice back. So just like with the front, we're going to be creating some lines of gathering. There are 2 sets of gathering stitches along the lower edge of the bodice back. So I've already sewn those stitches in there between the 2 sets of circles. And the next thing I'm going to do is just start pulling up those bobbin threads again. But with the back, keep in mind, there are not nearly as many gathers as there are on the front. Those gathers are very densely packed on the front, Whereas on the back, they're a little more like just little easing stitches. So don't go crazy, just gently pull up some bobbin threads and just a little bit of gathering. Okay, so the next thing is if you are going to be doing a cowl hood for your dress, you would be inserting it at this point, just basting it to these yoke seams. If you do want to do a cowl hood, I will be showing it later in the video, so you may just want to skip forward to that chapter marker. But for now, I'm going to be sewing it without the cowl hood. So I'm going to grab my bodice front and we're going to sew these yoke seams. So I'm pinning my bodice front to bodice back at the yoke seams. And what I'm going to do next is just distribute those gathers. So at this point, I'll be able to pull them up and just more accurately match the front to the back, adding more gathers if I need to, or reducing them, and pinning them in place. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other yoke seam. And next I'm sewing these seams using a narrow zigzag at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is press the seam allowance up towards the bodice back. I'm going to use a little low heat on my iron. I remembered back from when we did the Jasmine jumpsuit that this Lurex actually responds pretty well to just low heat and a little bit of steam, so that's what I'm doing here. But whatever you choose to do, you're just going to be pressing or finger pressing towards the bodice back. And there you can see how lovely these gathers look. Next, we're going to focus on the facings and sewing them together at the shoulder seams and then attaching them to the dress neckline. So first, make sure that you've already interfaced your facing back and your facing front. You can see that these mimic the shape of the neckline on both the front and the back, and you should have that same circle mark that you have on your bodice on the facing front. Next thing you're going to do is grab your facing back and put it right sides together with the front facings and pin them right sides together at these little yoke/shoulder seams. And now we're going to sew these little seams together using a narrow zigzag again, backstitching on both ends, and sew both sides. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press these seam allowances open. And again, I'm just using a really low heat because this Lurex can get damaged by high heat. So pressing both of these seam allowances open. And now the next thing we're going to do is sew this center front neckline seam on the facing. And you have to be really careful not to twist the facing when you pin this together. So you should have a circle mark here. I lost mine somehow, so I put a pin there instead where my circle mark was, and I'm just doing an X with pins to remind me where to stop stitching. And I'm going to place a couple pins, and then we're going to sew just this center front. Okay, so I'm still stitching at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching both ends. And now I'm going to press this open just like we did on the dress center front seam. Okay, so now I have a completed facing unit, and I'm going to grab my dress bodice and I'm going to put it right sides together with the facing around the neckline. So I like to start with matching my shoulder/yoke seams. making sure the seam allowances stay pressed the way that we pressed them previously. And then pin around the back neckline to the opposite yoke seam. Okay, now let's focus on this center front, because this is the most important part of sewing this seam. So this is really a butterfly seam. You can see we've got 2 sets of adjoining seam allowances that kind of form little wings. And we need to start stitching on one side exactly at that circle. And then we're going to stitch around the rest of the neckline, all the way around the back neckline and everything. And then we're going to end our stitching on the other side of that butterfly seam exactly at the circle mark there. And so the tricky thing about it is you have to get all those seam allowances out of the way as you're sewing. Okay, so just to review here, we've got these 2 little sets of wings. We need to get the seam allowances out of the way so we can start stitching on one side of the circle, so all the way around the neckline, and finish at the opposite side. All right, so the first thing I would do here is just check your center front point. You want to make sure that you don't have any holes here, or it's weirdly bunchy or got caught. You may see a little bit of pulling, but that should take care of itself once we trim these seam allowances. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is grading. So you're going to be trimming the facing shorter, and then the dress seam allowance will be slightly taller. After grading, just make sure you trim away any excess at that center front point. And next we are going to clip into the curves around the back neckline. And then next we're going to understitch. So you're going to want to understitch the facing just next to the seam line, making sure to catch the seam allowances underneath. Okay, so the next thing you can do is just lightly press this neckline, just rolling that understitching out to the edge. And you might want to spend a little time, especially with the center front point, just making sure that it's laying nice and flat. Just give it a little extra attention with some light steam or just light heat on the iron. And then what we're going to do next is baste these lower edges together where the facing meets the lower edge of the bodice, just so that stays in place there. And another thing you can do is at the yoke seams, you can stitch in the ditch to hold the facing in place underneath. And you will see that this facing does tend to pop out a little bit. So if that bothers you, you can also try some double-sided fusible at the center back neckline, or just tack it in place by hand, whatever you need to do to get it to stay in place. Okay, so you can see how my bodice has come together so far, looking so fun in this gold and teal lurex. So like I said, I stitched in the ditch at the shoulder seams. I did that with a straight stitch, and then I just basted the facing to the dress at this lower edge here to hold it in place. And then once it's on the body, this should all kind of look nice and beautiful. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is sew the midriffs to the front and back respectively. So here's what the front midriff looks like. And you can see we use the power mesh as is suggested, but it's optional, to stabilize just the midriff front. You don't want to do it in the back too, because then it becomes too hard to put the dress on. So because it just becomes too firm. So we just did the front. And we're gonna start here by pinning the bodice front to the midriff front. And you wanna make sure you match up your center points exactly right here, all right? And as we always say in the instructions, it can be helpful to draw in your seam allowances right here so you know exactly where the center point on your midriff is. Now we have some gathers to distribute as well, and circles to match. So kind of start there, matching those circles. And then you're gonna distribute the bust gathers between your pinned sections here until it's nice and flat. And I'm gonna continue pinning the other side. Okay, so now I am stitching with my narrow zigzag yet again. Back stitching. And I like to stitch from the side with the gathers. Just to keep them nice and flat. And make sure they don't bunch up as I'm stitching. And I'm going to pivot exactly at that center front seam allowance. And then when you pivot, just make sure you get all of any little folds out of the way. Okay, so you're just gonna wanna check for any little lumps or bumps after stitching. And the next thing is that this will get pressed up towards the bust. You may want to reduce these seam allowances here because it does get quite bulky right at that center point. So you can grade your seam allowances, you can just trim them down, you can serge them together. Whatever works best for your fabric is what you're going to want to do. So there are a few options, but you just want to reduce bulk here. I'm going to grade mine as 1 just so that I don't have quite so much bulk here. Okay, now we're going to do the exact same thing. Well, not exact, as the shapes are a little bit different, but we're going to do the same idea on the bodice back with the midriff. So grab your back midriff and you're going to match the sides with the circles to the midriff, to the bodice back. Match your circles, and again, you're going to be distributing any gathers. And like I said, these gathers are much more subtle than the bust gathers, so keep that in mind. So as you can see, just a real subtle amount of gathers. And now I'm going to stitch the seam. Okay, so again, I'm going to finish these seam allowances as desired, press them up. And then the final thing to do in this little section is to sew the side seams, okay? So you're gonna put the side seams right sides together, and you are going to match those midriff seams pressed up, and then sew from one raw edge to the other, and then press them open. So that's it for this little section, and then we will come back and move on to the next step. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna work on now that we have our bodice constructed is our short sleeves. So I'll be showing the bishop sleeve later, so you can skip forward to that in the chapters if you want to, but for this chapter, we're gonna be focusing on this cute little 40s style sleeve. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is deal with the pleat. So you should have marked on the wrong side of your fabric 3 sets of pleat lines here. And what we're gonna do is bring the outermost lines together. You can see we have notches here too to help us. And then we're gonna pin along these pleat lines that are now on top of each other. And there's one in the middle. And we're gonna stitch right along this line. I'm gonna use a straight stitch. A zigzag isn't really necessary here. And make sure to back stitch on both ends. Okay, now that we've sewn the pleat, now we're going to baste it in place. So this is a box pleat. So that means that instead of getting the bulk of the pleat getting pressed to one side, this is going to be pressed open like this behind the stitching. All right, so you're gonna take the pleat, the body of the pleat, and kind of just smush it over so that the center line is now aligned with your stitching line. Pin it in place, and now we'll baste in place right here, but you can see it creates this cute little pleat here. All right, so I'm just using a longer stitch to baste this in place at 1/2 inch. And there we have it. Okay, so there's our adorable little pleat. And now the next thing we're gonna do is sew the underarm seams of the sleeve. So put these right sides together. And as you might have already guessed, I'm gonna be switching back to my narrow zigzag here because we want to retain the stretch in this seam. Okay, now we're gonna press this little seam open. All right, and now I would suggest that now is a really good time to do your sleeve hem, okay? So we're gonna be turning this up 5/8 of an inch, pressing it in place all the way around. And then what I'm gonna do next is I'm going to top stitch using a narrow zigzag at 1/2 inch on the right side, okay? So go ahead and hem your sleeves and then we will set them in. Okay, so you can see that I finished hemming my sleeves with that little narrow zigzag. And so the hemming stitches go right over the stitching on the pleat, just so you know. So it looks like that. And because we used a narrow zigzag, it will still stretch nicely. And then the next thing we're gonna do is set our sleeve into the bodice. So just like any sleeve, you should have a single notch in the front and a double notch in the back to help you set them in to match the bodice. And as I mentioned earlier in the pattern pieces chapter, there is a lot of gathering in this sleeve cap for that very 40s look. So this sleeve cap is gonna look bigger than your usual sleeve cap, and also it's bigger than the bishop sleeve cap, which has no gathering at all. It's just eased in for a smooth look, okay? But this one, we wanted to go all out with gathers, so we're going to pull up our gathering stitches, which I've already sewn, by the way, between the sets of circles. And I'm gonna be concentrating more gathers than I would if I were just setting in a sleeve with no gathers, because that would just be an easing situation, and this is a full gathering situation. So you're gonna want some dense gathers up here. And then we will distribute them correctly when we set it into the sleeve, or the arm side, which is the step we're doing next. Okay, I feel like I went a little bit crazy. I can back off a little bit. The other thing that you always want to make sure that you have is the notch at the top of the sleeve cap. So let me find that. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is set this sleeve into the bodice. I'm gonna match those underarm seams first. And next I'm going to match any notches and circles. And then we're just going to distribute the gathers evenly from there. Okay, and now we are ready to stitch. And again, using a narrow zigzag. Okay, so now you're just going to check your sleeve from the right side of the bodice. Make sure you don't have any weird bunching, which can happen sometimes with gathers, but this looks pretty good. Look how beautiful. Okay, so what we're gonna do next is just trim these seam allowances down to 3/8 of an inch so you don't have all this bulk inside there. And then if you like, you can finish the seam allowances as one using a serger or whatever method you're using. But also know that with knits, you can leave them unfinished because they're not gonna fray. All right, so that is it for your short sleeve. Okay, so next thing we're gonna do is assemble the skirt and then attach it to the bodice. I've already assembled the skirt. This is the knee length one, by the way. We're gonna talk about the floor length one in a later chapter. And I've already assembled the side seams because it's just sewing the side seams. I figured you guys didn't need to see me do that, but so I sewed the side seams, pressed them open. One thing I would tell you is that it's a good idea to mark your back or your front. I just used disappearing ink and put a B on the back so that I would remember, because they do look the same. And now we're going to sew the skirt to our bodice. So right sides together, so I'm gonna put the bodice inside out. And then put the skirt inside the bodice, I guess is a good way to do it. Match those side seams. And then just continue to pin around the waistline. Okay, now we're ready to stitch this. And I am on a zigzag again. If you want, you can go a little bit wider on your zigzag. What's really important on this seam is that you stretch the fabric just a little as you're sewing. If you don't, it's easy to bust these stitches open when you're putting the dress on because it's such a fitted midriff, so it's easy if you don't have enough stretch in your stitches for the seams to break. So what I would suggest is that you just pull slightly as you're stitching from the front and the back. Like so. And that will help build more stretch into your waistline seam. Okay, so that's our waistline seam. You're gonna press this up, and you can grade these seam allowances or just trim them together down to around 3/8 of an inch. And then finish them however you're finishing your seam. So whether that's leaving them completely unfinished or if you're serging them, whichever way is totally fine. Okay, and then the last thing on this dress, believe it or not, we've got a finished dress. for this version would be to hem the skirt. So you can let it hang for 24 hours if you might get some uneven stretching. If you're not worried about that, and some jerseys really don't stretch like a woven would on the bias, you're gonna go ahead and just hem it, turn it up at 5/8 of an inch. And just like we did on the little sleeve hem, you're gonna press at 5/8 of an inch and then top stitch at 1/2 an inch using a narrow zigzag. And that is it for this little short swing dress version in Lurex. So I'm gonna come back and talk about some of the skills you'll wanna know for the floor length gown with the hood and the bishop sleeve and those beautiful godets in the skirt. Okay, so we're ready to move on to the elements of the more dramatic gown, the cowl hood, the bishop sleeve, and then the godet skirt. So we're gonna start with the cowl hood. It's a pretty simple piece. You're gonna have 2 sets of this piece here. And like we talked about in the pattern chapter, the only part that's gonna get inserted into the dress is this little curved edge right here, and that gets inserted into the shoulder yoke seam. Okay, but first we have to assemble the hood and self-line it. Okay, so you're gonna have 2 sets of these. Start with 1, right sides together, and we are going to pin and stitch it along this outer curved edge. There's one edge with a double notch, and that's the back of the hood, the one that lays against your back. And then one single notch, which is the front of the hood or the side that would be on your head when the hood is pulled up. Okay, but we're just gonna sew this one curved edge, right sides together. Narrow zigzag, 5/8 of an inch, the usual. So here we go. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is just trim down this seam allowance. I would say about 1/4 inch is best. This fabric I'm using is a rayon jersey, which is really lovely. It has a lovely drape. When I ordered it, it said matte jersey, so I was expecting it to be a little slinkier, but it feels almost like a t-shirt kind of bamboo quality, but it's 100% rayon. So this gown is going to be very comfy and cozy and nice and soft against the skin. So I'm actually pretty excited about it. Okay, so the next thing to do is to press the seam allowance open. Because this is rayon, it can withstand a little higher heat than synthetics and things like the Lurex, which have a metallic fiber in it. I'm going to use a little steam. And as you can see, I'm using my ham because this is a curved seam, so this will help me press. Okay, I'm going to repeat all those steps with my second pair of hood pieces, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to sew them together. Okay, so now we're ready to sew our 2 hoods together. So you've got this funny looking piece. We're saying in the studio how it looks like a stingray or a sailfish or something. So you're gonna take your 2 little stingrays and you're going to put them right sides together. And you wanna make sure that you're matching notches, because like I said, one side has single notches and the other side has double notches. And you want to make sure that you match that center seam. Okay, and then I'm gonna turn her around. It's a she. I'm gonna turn her around and pin the other side. With the double notches. Okay, so I'm just gonna go ahead, I'm gonna keep pinning and then I'm gonna go ahead and sew along each of these long notched edges. And what you wanna be careful of is you gotta leave this open. These short curved ends, leave them open, don't stitch them. Just these long notched edges, okay? So I'm gonna stitch these and then I'm gonna trim them down like we did the center seam to 1/4 inch. And then I'll come back to show you the next step. Okay, so I have trimmed both sides and now I'm gonna turn this right side out. And the next thing we're gonna do is just press these edges flat on top of each other. So you're going to want to take your time with this. And use the highest heat your fabric will withstand, because we want to get a nice pressed edge here, if possible. And same thing on the lower edge. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do with the hood is grab our bodice back. And you're going to place it right side up. And you're gonna place the hood onto the bodice back, matching the circles at this yoke seam. Like so. Okay, and then the hood just drapes around like this. Make sure it's not twisted so you don't get like an infinity hood. And now I'm just gonna baste the hood in place on these shoulder seams right here. So use a longer stitch, and it can be a narrow zigzag again. I'm gonna baste this in place at 1/2 inch. Okay, there's one side, do the other. Okay, there we go. So at this point you would go back in the video because the next thing to do is to attach these seams to the front, okay? And so what happens is that the hood gets caught in between, it's sandwiched in that seam. And then you just kind of carry on with the bodice as you normally would. I will say you got to be really careful of this hood to make sure that when you're doing any other stitching, it doesn't get caught in it. So you can just kind of bundle it up and keep it out of the way. All right, so there is your beautiful cowl hood. Okay, so the next thing we are going to sew is the bishop sleeve. So as you can see, I have already sewn my underarm seam on the sleeve, pressed it open. I have also sewn easing stitches on the cap from the single notch to the double notch. And then I've sewn my gathering stitches on the hem between the circles. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually pull up these gathering stitches from the wrong side. And this sleeve has a ton of gathers at the wrist, so you're really going to want to pack them in there. And now we're ready to sew the cuff. Okay, so now we're working on our cuff. You are going to grab your cuff piece and just note that it looks like an hourglass kind of with a notch on each straight end. And the pattern piece has a fold line across the middle here. And the first thing we're going to do is press this wrong sides together. And we're going to create a crease along this lower edge. This will be the wrist edge. So just press in a soft crease there. And then on one of these notched edges, you're going to press in 5/8 of an inch. Okay, now unfold everything flat again. And so you have these creases as reference points later. And what we're gonna do is fold it right sides together along this angled edge. And we're gonna pin here. And we're gonna sew this seam. So make sure your machine is back at a narrow zigzag after you did that gathering. And we're gonna stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. You're gonna need to pivot slightly at that center fold line. Okay, and you can trim this seam allowance down slightly to about 3/8 of an inch. And then I would give it a little clip at the center fold line. And the next thing you're going to do is press those seam allowances open. All right, now we're ready to sew it to that gathered edge of our sleeve. So the side that you didn't turn in the seam allowance and crease it, I would match that side, right sides together, to your sleeve. So this is a little awkward just because this cuff is so tiny and slim. I would start by matching the seam lines. And then you're just going to pin all the way around. And because the gathers are so densely packed in here, there's not a lot of distributing to do because they just need to be packed as tightly as you can make them. And now we're ready to stitch. And because this circumference is so tiny, you're not going to be able to put this on the free arm of your machine. So you're going to have to sew from the inside of the circle, like this. Using that narrow zigzag yet again. And just watch out for your pins here because they can creep up to where you're stitching. Okay, now you can trim down these seam allowances, and I would suggest holding your scissors at an angle towards you, which will grade the seam allowances in one step. So see how it's creating a grade naturally just through the angle of the scissors. There we go. And now, the final thing to do is let's work from the inside, from the wrong side now. You're going to flip up the cuff on that first crease line that you made. Turn the whole thing to the wrong side. And where you turn the seam allowance in, you're going to refold it and pin it in place so that it's covering that seam you just sewed. You're going to do that all the way around. And then finally, you're just going to hand stitch here using a slip stitch. That will give you the least bulk. Hand stitch all the way around, and then you'll be ready to set this sleeve into your dress. So this sleeve is not gathered at the cap like the short sleeve is. So just slightly ease it up and then set it in, and you'll you don't have the, normally we put a notch right at the top where it meets the shoulder seam. There is no shoulder seam on this dress, so there's one where it meets the yoke instead. So keep that in mind when you're setting that into the dress. And there you go, that is your bishop sleeve. All right, so we're ready to look at our godet skirt. So as I mentioned, the skirt has 6 godets, 2 in the front, 2 in the back, and then 1 at each side seam. Now the 2 in the front and the 2 in the back are inserted slightly differently than the side seam ones. So first I'm going to talk about the slash godets, which are the ones in the front and the back, and then we'll come back and talk about the side seam godets. So slash godet is inserted into the skirt itself, okay? So you actually have to cut open your fabric and insert a godet like you see here. It's a really cool effect, very 30s, very 40s, and it provides extra fullness to the skirt while also being a design feature. Now, I've already done one, as you can see on the front, and I'm going to show you the other one. So here's my marked slash mark, and I just wanted to give you a few tips for marking this as well, because it can be hard to, with chalk or with a tracing wheel, mark this long line all the way down in jersey. So I did want to mention one thing you can do on the pattern piece is use an awl to make a hole like every few inches like this, and then go through the pattern onto the fabric below, make a circle mark like this, and then you'll be able to use a ruler to connect it with your invisible ink pen or whatever you're using to mark your pattern. Okay, so that makes it a little bit easier than trying to use a tracing wheel. And the next thing we're gonna do is reinforce the top of the slash point, that circle right here. So you're going to want to grab a piece of 2 by 2 inch fusible interfacing and just center it over the circle mark at the end of the slash mark and fuse it in place. And this is for reinforcement because we are going to be cutting right up to this point. And make sure that you can see your mark through the fabric or through the interfacing. If you can't, you can just retransfer it here, okay? And then just to note, you have your godet pieces and there will be a coordinating circle at the top of the godet at the skinny edge, okay? But first we're gonna actually cut open this slash mark. And I know this is probably a little bit scary, but you've got this. Just cut all the way from the bottom exactly to the circle point, the circle mark at the end where you interfaced. Okay, now be careful here. You want to use just the tip of your scissors and only cut to that circle. All right, so there you go. That wasn't so bad, right? And now you are going to take your godet piece, and this circle is going to get matched up to the circle and actually go wrong sides together. So the mark should be facing you. So I'm sorry, I said that wrong. So it's the right side of the godet is facing down. The right side should be facing you. And I'm just going to pin those circles together like that. And now what we're going to do is we're going to right sides together. See, I got it, I got there. You're going to pin each side of the godet to the slash. And what we're going to be doing is stitching from the circle down on each side. All right. And what you're going to find as you pin is that there's going to be a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance here to nothing on the godet itself. And then it's going to like eventually taper so that these raw edges match. Now you have notches on the godet, but there are no notches to match on the slash, obviously, because you just made the slash. So you're gonna pin from top to bottom. And this is a really long piece, so I'm doing my best to show you the whole thing. All right, so we're gonna stitch one side and then we're gonna come back and pin and stitch the other side. All right, so let's go to the machine. And we're gonna start stitching right here at this circle point. And here, you can take the pin out from the wrong side and place it right here. All right, so angling to nothing. We're gonna start stitching right at that circle mark, and do not backstitch here. You're gonna leave yourself some long thread tails that later we will tie off. Okay, so like I said, you want those long thread tails. You can use a straight stitch here. This seam doesn't really need to stretch that much. So you're gonna wanna put your needle down. Oh, and make sure you have those long thread tails. Okay, did I already say that? You're going to put your needle down right at the circle mark. Okay, and don't backstitch. Start stitching here. And then I'm just looking at my seam allowance over here. It's 5/8 of an inch. And now I have my raw edges matching here. And when you get to the bottom, you can backstitch. Okay, so there's one side of my godet sewn with long thread tails to tie off later. And now we need to do the other side. So again, you're gonna be pinning the same way. On this side, we are going to need to be stitching from the circle. It's always best to stitch from the circle down. So as you can imagine, now that we've flipped this over, it's gonna make it a little weird at the machine because normally we have the bulk of our work to the right of our needle, but now no, I said that wrong. Can you tell it's getting late in the day? Normally we have the bulk of the work to the left of our needle, but now we're gonna have the bulk of the work to the right of our needle. There, I got there. So it's gonna be a little weird, but this is the best way to do it so that you don't have a pucker at the top of your godet. All right, I'm gonna keep pinning and then I will sew this like I sewed the other side. Okay, so I got my long thread tails again. I'm gonna start right at that circle mark. My machine has marks to the left of the needle, which is great for things like this. If yours doesn't, you can go ahead and put some washi tape or something there 5/8 of an inch from the needle, because you will need that. So I'm gonna lower my needle right at the circle mark. And we're off. Okay, so now you can see we have a lovely inserted godet. It is not tied off yet though. So what we need to do is go back to the wrong side. And as you can see, I have 2 threads on the top of the godet. And what I need to do is to pull them to the wrong side. So the way you do that is one at a time. I'm gonna take each of these threads, and if you pull it up, just give it a gentle tug, and then you'll see a loop form at the base. And you're gonna pull up that loop, and that's the thread from the other side coming to the wrong side. And do the same with the other thread there. So now you have 2 sets of 2 threads, and now I'm gonna tie them in a double knot. Like so, nice and tight, and then you can trim that. You can also trim these points off here. You don't need all this excess now that you've sewed it, so you can just kind of trim to 5/8 or whatever. All right, so that is your inserted godet. Oh, I should mention that you are going to want to press this. So the godets get pressed towards the skirt, okay, not towards the godet, so like that. Okay, so that's your slash godet. I'm gonna keep pressing this, and then I'll come back and tell you about how to do the side seam godet. Okay, so now that we've done the slash godets, I wanna show you a little bit about how to do the side seam godet. It's much simpler, let's say. So the side seam of the skirt, this is the waist. You can see it has this slight jut right here, a bit of an angle with a circle mark to match your godet. So you're gonna work on the front of the skirt first, and you're going to take a godet and you're going to match that circle. And this will be a little bit easier because you will have notches to match on this one, because it's not a newly created slash. The pattern has notches to help you. So you're gonna pin all the way down and then stitch from the hem up to the circle only, okay? And then you're going to repeat the same thing with your other side seam godet on the skirt front. And then you'll have your completed skirt back with its 2 slash godets, and you'll be ready to just sew a simple side seam from the skirt back to the skirt front with the godet. All right, so this will be like this, and then you will sew the skirt back right sides together here, all right? And you'll need to pivot slightly at the godet all the way up to the waist, okay? So simpler to do the side seam godet because you don't have to actually slash into your fabric. And then you're going to attach the skirt to the bodice just like you did with the other skirt, stretching slightly as you sew to make sure that it retains its stretch. And then you just have your finishing work to do, your hem. So that is it for your dramatic floor length gown. Okay, everyone, I hope you have loved learning how to sew the society dress today. We've gone over so much, including how to sew 2 totally different variations of this dress. We've talked about how to work with knits, how to sew with high stretch fabrics, and how to make that amazing cowl hood, and also inserting godets, which we've never done before. So I hope you learned a lot today, and I hope you feel inspired to make one in every possible variation. Don't forget to use the hashtags society dress and charm patterns when posting on social media. We love to see your makes. So I can't wait to see what you create, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.